everyone and welcome to this course on business economics. Here is something worth thinking about before we dive into the course. Every time a company sets a price, plans its production, decides whether to expand into a new market or responds to a competitor, there is an economic logic driving that decision. Most business professionals feel the effects of that logic every day without ever being taught the frameworks behind it. That is exactly the gap this course is designed to close. Over 6 lessons, we are going to walk through the complete framework a business economist uses to analyze and guide real decisions. We will start with the foundations, that is the core concepts that everything else in this course builds on. From there, we move into demand and supply analysis, where you will understand how markets actually set prices and how elasticity shapes business strategy in ways most people overlook. Then we get into production and cost analysis, how businesses combine resources efficiently and what happens to cost as they scale. After that, we will look at market structures because the competitive landscape a business sits in has a direct impact on its pricing power and strategic options. Lesson 5 brings it all together into pricing strategies and real business decisions, where economic principles stop being theory and start becoming choices. And we close with the macroeconomic environment, that is inflation, interest rates, business cycles, the broader context that every business decision ultimately gets made within. So whether you work in marketing, finance, operations, or strategy, this course gives you a way of thinking that connects directly to the decisions your organizations make every single day. Also, if you're looking to strengthen your leadership and management skills beyond business economics, then you can also explore Simplilearn's PMP certification training. This program helps you build practical project management skills, including planning, risk management, budgeting, stakeholder management, and agile and hybrid project delivery approaches. With exam-aligned learning, real-world scenarios, practice simulations, and expert guidance, this course prepares you to take the next step in your project management career. So if project management is an area you want to explore, make sure to check out this course and continue building skills that can help you lead projects and drive business outcomes effectively. So now let's get started. Hello everyone and welcome to this course on business economics. This course is structured with one goal in mind: to give you a practical, structured understanding of how economic principles shape real business decisions. So whether you work in marketing, finance, operations, strategy, or any other business function, economics is a lens you will use every single day, often without even realizing it. So every pricing decision, every production plan, every expansion or investment choice has an economic logic underneath it. Yet this way of thinking is rarely taught in a way that connects directly to real business scenarios. That gap is exactly what this course addresses. This course walks you through the complete framework a business economist uses to analyze and guide decisions, from understanding how markets set prices all the way through production, competition, price strategy, and the broader economic environment a business operates within. So in this course, we will cover 6 lessons. And lesson 1 introduces the course and the foundations of business economics, setting up the core concepts that everything else builds on. Lesson 2, it covers demand and supply analysis, how market determines price, how elasticity shapes business strategy. Lesson 3 covers production and cost analysis, how business combine resources efficiently and manage cost as they scale. Lesson 4 covers market structures and how the competitive landscape a business operates in shapes its pricing power and strategy. Lesson 5 focuses on pricing strategies and business decisions and how businesses translate economic principles into real pricing and go-to-market choices. Lesson 6 covers the macroeconomic environment, how factors like inflation, interest rates, and business cycles shape the broader context every business decision is made within. So by the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain the scope of business economics and differentiate between microeconomics and macroeconomics in a business context. You'll also be able to apply the laws of demand and supply and use elasticity to predict how price changes affect revenue, and analyze production functions and cost structures to identify efficient output levels and break-even points. You will be able to distinguish between the 4 major market structures and evaluate how each shapes pricing power and competitive strategy. You'll also know how to evaluate and select appropriate pricing strategies, that is including cost plus, value-based, penetration, skimming, and price discrimination based on the business context. You will understand how to assess and how microeconomic indicators like GDP, inflation, interest rates, and business cycles influence business planning and decision making. You will know how to integrate microeconomic and macroeconomic reasoning to make informed, data-backed business decisions. So now let's get started. In this lesson, we will build a strong foundation in business economics and understand why it matters for every business decision you will ever be part of. We will begin by looking at what business economics means and how it applies economic theory to real practical business problems. Next, we will explore the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics and see how each shapes decisions at different levels of a business. We will also discuss positive versus normative economics and understand why business economists focus on facts rather than opinions when analyzing decisions. Finally, we will look at the core economic problem of scarcity and opportunity cost, along with the 4 factors of production, so you can understand the fundamental building blocks every business decision rests on. So let's get started. So before you can make smart business decisions, you need to understand the economic forces shaping them. So this lesson lays the foundation, and by the end of it, you will be able to look at any business decision and immediately identify the economic logic underneath it. So let's start with the question every business owner has asked at some point. Should I lower my price to sell more or hold my price to protect my margin? That's not a gut feel question. It's an economic question. And by the end of this course, you will know how to answer it with data and not guesswork. So now let's understand why business economics matter. Here's something worth sitting for a moment. Every single day, business make decisions worth crores of rupees based on economic reasoning, whether they realize it or not. So when Swiggy decides to run a discount campaign, that's a decision rooted in elasticity of demand. When a steel manufacturer decides whether to expand its factory, that's a decision rooted in production economics and cost analysis. When the RBI changes the repo rate and suddenly your company's loan becomes more expensive, that's macroeconomics reaching directly into your balance sheet. So business economics is the discipline that gives you the vocabulary and the tools to understand and predict these patterns instead of reacting to them after the fact. So what is business economics exactly? Business economics is something called as managerial economics. It's the application of economic theory and quantitative methods to real business decisions. It sits at the intersection of economic theory and business practice. Think of it this way. Pure economic theory tells you how markets behave in general, how demand curves slope, how firms maximize profit under different conditions. Business economics takes that theory and asks, given everything we know about how markets and firms behave, what should this specific business do right now with the resource that it has? So it's applied, not purely academic. A business economist isn't just interested in understanding the theory of monopoly. They're interested in whether their company should raise prices by 8% next quarter and what will happen to sales if they do. So let's look at 2 lenses that matter here. That is micro and macroeconomics. So microeconomics looks at individual units, that is a single firm, a single consumer, a single market. This is the lens for questions like how much should we produce, what price should we charge, how will customers react if we change our product. Microeconomics is granular, it zooms in. Macroeconomics looks at the big picture, national income, inflation, unemployment, interest rates, exchange rates. This is a lens for questions like, is the economy heading into a slowdown? Will inflation eat into our margins next year? Or should we expand into international markets given the current exchange rate trend? Here's a useful way to remember the difference. Microeconomics helps you make the decision inside your business, and macroeconomics helps you understand the environment your business operates within. So an environment you don't control but absolutely must plan around. So a pricing decision for a single product is microeconomic decision. A decision to expand into a new country because interest rates dropped and borrowing became cheaper is a macro influence decision. So most real business strategy actually blends both. You're making micro level decisions inside a macro level environment that's constantly shifting. So now that we understood the difference between micro and macroeconomics, let's move into the next module and explore how these 2 perspectives work together to influence the real world business decisions. So a successful business does not operate in isolation. It makes internal decisions while constantly adapting to external economic forces. This distinction sounds academic, but it has an extremely practical use in business. Positive economics deals with the facts and testable statement. If we raise prices by 10%, demand will likely fall by 6%. That's a claim you can actually test with the data. It doesn't involve opinion. It's describing what it is or what will likely happen. Normative economics deals with value judgments and opinions. We should raise prices, or this price is unfair to customers. That involves a judgment about what ought to happen based on someone's values or priorities. So business economists work primarily in positive economics. Their job is to analyze what will happen under different scenarios. If we raise price or if we launch in a new city, if input costs rise by 15%, then they hand that analysis to business leaders who combine it with company values, risk appetite, and strategic priority to decide what the business should actually do. So this separation matters because it keeps analysis honest. A good business economist doesn't start with the answer they want and work backward. They model the data objectively first, then let decision makers apply judgment on top of that. So why does every choice has a cost? Every business decision, when you strip it down, boils down to one core economic problem, that is scarcity. So every business, from a roadside stall to a multinational enterprise, has limited resources, limited money, limited time, limited people, limited factory capacity, limited attention. And yet there are unlimited ways the resources could be used. Because resources are scarce, every decision to use a resource one way is simultaneously a decision not to use it another way. That's the essence of opportunity cost, the value of the next best alternative you gave up when you made a choice. Let's make this concrete. Suppose a mid-sized company has 50 lakhs rupees to invest this quarter and it's choosing between a marketing campaign and an R&D upgrade. So if it picks the marketing campaign, the opportunity cost is whatever return the R&D investment would have been generated had they chosen that path instead. So if the R&D investment would have generated 80 lakhs in future revenue and the marketing campaign only generated 60 lakhs, the company made a decision with a real opportunity cost of 20 lakhs in foregone value, even though no cash was technically lost. This is why experienced business leaders rarely ask, can we afford this in isolation? They ask, given everything else we could do with this money, is this the best use of it? And that is opportunity cost thinking. So before we move to the role of a business economist, it's worth quickly exploring what actually goes into producing goods and services. Economists traditionally group inputs into 4 factors of production. The first one is land, natural resources used in production, from farmland to mineral deposits to the physical office space a company occupies. Second is labor, which is the human effort, both physical and intellectual, that goes into producing goods and services. Next is capital, not just money, but the tools, machinery, technology, and infrastructure that is used to produce goods and services. A factory's assembly line is a capital. A software company's server infrastructure is capital. Entrepreneurship, the factor that combines the other 3, taking on risk to organize production and bring goods or services to the market. So every business decision ultimately involves allocating these 4 factors efficiently. Business economics gives you a structured way to reason about that allocation. So now let's quickly look into the role of a business economist. Their work typically clusters around a few core questions. What price maximizes profit? This requires understanding both cost structure and how customers respond to price changes. How will a competitor's move affect our market share? This requires understanding market structure. Are we in a market with many competitors or a handful of dominant players? Should we expand production now or wait? This requires cost analysis and demand forecasting. What will the broader economic environment look like next year, and how should that shape our strategy? This is a macroeconomic analysis. So in short, a business economist's job is to convert uncertainty into informed decisions. Businesses never have perfect information. They're always operating with incomplete data about the future. Business economics doesn't eliminate that uncertainty, but it gives you a rigorous framework to make the best possible decision given what you know. So let's quickly have a recap of what we have learned in this lesson. We explored how business economics applies economic theory and quantitative tools to real business decisions. We understood that microeconomics helps businesses make firm-level decisions, while macroeconomics helps them navigate the broader economic environment. We also learned the difference between positive economics, which focused on the facts and predictions, and normative economics, which involves value judgments. We discussed how scarcity forces every business to make choices and how every choice comes with an opportunity cost. Finally, we looked at the 4 factors of production, that is land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, which form the foundations of every business decision, and how a business economist's role is to transform uncertainty into informed data-driven decisions. So if lesson 1 gave you the lens to think like an economist, lesson 2 gives you the first real working tool, demand and supply. This is the engine behind every pricing decision, every stock out you've ever experienced, every discount sale you've ever seen. Once you understand this framework properly, you will start noticing it everywhere, in grocery store pricing, in cab fare search pricing, in real estate markets, everywhere. So in this lesson, we will build a strong understanding of demand and supply, the 2 forces that determines price and quantity in every market. We will begin by looking at the law of demand and the law of supply, and why demand curves slope downward while supply curves slope upward. We'll also explore the key determinants that shift demand and supply beyond just price, such as income, related goods, technology, and government policy. We'll also discuss elasticity of demand and supply and see how this concept directly informs pricing and revenue decisions. Finally, we will look at market equilibrium and the important distinction between a movement along a curve and a shift of the curve, so you can understand how markets adjust to the change. So let's get started. So let's begin with demand. In economics, demand isn't just wanting something. It specifically means the quantity of a good or a service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at a given price during a given time period. So the willing and the able part matters. Wanting a Ferrari isn't demand if you can't actually pay for it. So demand requires both desire and purchasing power. The law of demand states that all else being equal, as price rises, quantity demanded falls, and as price falls, quantity demanded rises. So why does this relationship exist? There are two underlying reasons the economists point to. First, a substitution effect. When a product's price rises, consumers start looking for a cheaper alternative that serves a similar purpose. So if the price of a chicken rises sharply, some consumers switch to eggs or plant-based protein instead. The income effect. A price rise effectively reduces a consumer's real purchasing power even if their income hasn't changed. So if petrol prices rise, your salary buys less petrol than before. So functionally, you're poorer in terms of what you can purchase and you cut back. Together, these two effects explain why demand curves slope downward almost universally. So supply works from the producer's side. It refers to the quantity of a good or service that producers are willing and able to sell at a given price during a given time of period. So law of supply is essentially the mirror image of the law of demand. As price rises, producers are willing to supply more because higher prices typically mean higher potential profit per unit. This gives us an upward sloping supply curve. Think about a farmer growing wheat. If wheat prices rise significantly, that farmer has a strong incentive to allocate more land to wheat next season. So you use better fertilizer and try to maximize the output because each unit sold now earns more. If prices fall, the incentive reverses. So price is a variable that moves you along a demand curve. But several other factors can shift the entire curve, meaning demand changes at every price level, not just because of a price change. So income levels. As consumer income rises, demand for most goods rises too. These are called normal goods. But for certain goods called inferior goods, demand actually falls as income rises. Cheaper substitute foods often see this. As people earn more, they often switch away from cheaper staples toward premium options. Price of related goods. If the price of a substitute good changes, demand for your product shifts. If Pepsi's price falls, demand for Coca-Cola may fall too, as people switch. If the price of a complementary good changes, like petrol and cars, demand shifts as well. A rise in petrol prices can dampen demand for larger, less fuel-efficient cars. Consumer preferences and trends. So shifts in taste, driven by advertising, social trends, or health consciousness, shift demands independent of price. The recent shift towards health-conscious eating in India has visibly moved demand towards organic and low-sugar products. Population and demographics. As population grows or as the demographic max shifts, more young professionals in a city, for instance, overall market demand shifts accordingly. Future price expectations. If consumers expect prices to rise soon, they often buy now, increasing current demand. So this is a common pattern before festival seasons or anticipated tax changes. Social factors such as advertising, health awareness, and changing lifestyles can influence consumer preferences. So for example, the growing focus on healthy eating in India has increased demand for organic and low-sugar products. So when supply increases, the supply curve shifts right, showing higher quantity supplied at every price level. So supply shifts due to non-price factors. For example, input cost. If raw materials or labor cost rises, producing each unit becomes more expensive and supply at every price level falls. A spike in steel prices, for example, reduces the willingness of a construction company to supply new housing at existing price levels. Technology. Improvements in technology typically increase supply because production becomes more efficient and cheaper per unit. Automation in manufacturing is a clear real-world example. It's shifted entire supply curves outward across the industries. So number of sellers. As more firms enter a market, total market supply increases independent of individual pricing decisions. Government policy and taxation. Taxes on production reduce supply by rising costs. Subsidies increase supply by lowering effective cost. GST changes, import duties, and production-linked incentive schemes all shift supply curves in real markets. Producer expectations. If producers expect prices to rise in the future, they may hold back current supply to sell later at higher prices. This is common in commodity and real estate markets. So now we get to one of the most practical, useful concepts in the entire course, that is elasticity. So elasticity measures how much quantity demanded reacts to change in a price or to a change in another variable like income. Price elasticity of demand measures how sensitive quantity demand is to price change. If a small price change causes a larger change in quantity demanded, demand is elastic. If quantity demanded barely moves even with a big price change, demand is inelastic. Luxury items. Premium smartphones, designer clothing tend to be elastic because consumers can easily delay or skip the purchase if price rises. Necessities. Salt or basic medicines, stable grains tend to be inelastic because consumers need them regardless of price and have few subsidies. This has enormous strategic value. If you know your product has inelastic demand, a price increase will likely increase your total revenue because a small drop in quantity sold won't offset the higher price per unit. But if your product has elastic demand, raising price could actually hurt total revenue because you will lose a disproportionate number of customers. Income elasticity of demand measures how demand shifts as consumer income changes. Positive income elasticity means it's normal good. Demand rises with income. Negative income elasticity means it's an inferior good. Demand falls as income rises because consumers upgrade to better alternatives. Cross elasticity of demand measures how demand for one good changes when the price of a different good changes. Positive cross elasticity identifies as one gets pricier, demand for the other rises. Negative cross elasticity identifies complements as one gets pricier, demand for the other falls too, since they are typically used together. Elasticity of supply measures how responsive producers are to price changes, specifically how quickly and easily they can ramp production up or down. This is often driven by how flexible production is. A factory that can quickly add shifts has more elastic supply than a farm that must wait an entire growing season to increase the output. Now that we understood how demand and supply respond to change in the market, let's bring these two forces together and see how they interact to determine the price and quantity at which the market reaches balance. So when the demand curve and supply curve intersect, you will get the market equilibrium. The price and the quantity at which the market clears, meaning the quantity consumers want to buy exactly matches the quantity producers wants to sell. So above equilibrium, you get a surplus. Producers wants to sell more than what consumers want to buy, which creates downward pressure on price. Below equilibrium, you get a shortage. Consumers want to buy more than producers are willing to supply, creating upward pressure on price. So markets naturally tend to move towards equilibrium over time unless something interferes, like price controls or supply disruptions. So a movement along the curve happens purely because of a change in the goods' own price. If the price of a product rises and the quantity demanded falls, you're moving along the same demand curve, nothing about the underlying relationship changed. You're just at a different point on it. A shift of the entire curve happens because of a change in a non-price determinant. A change in income, a change in a competitor's price, a new technology, a change in consumer taste. So when this happens at every price level, the quantity demanded or supplied changes. Visually, the whole curve moves towards left or right. Here's a quick mental test. If a business raises its own price and sales fall, that's a movement along the demand curve. If a competitor launches a cheaper alternative and your sales fall, even though you didn't change your price, that's a shift of your demand curve to the left. Getting this distinction right matters enormously in real business analysis. So if sales fell due to a price increase you made, that's within your control to reverse. If sales fell because of a shifted curve, say a new competitor pricing alone won't fix. You may need a different lever like product differentiation. So let's have a quick recap of this lesson. In this lesson, we understood that demand falls as price rises due to substitution and income effects, supply rises as price rises due to profit incentives. Both demand and supply are shaped by several non-price determinants and not just price. Elasticity measures sensitivity to price or income changes and directly informs pricing strategy. Market equilibrium is where supply meets demand. Deviations create surplus or shortage. Price changes cause movement along a curve. Non-price factors cause the entire curve to shift, a critical distinction for real business decision. Now that you understood how markets set prices through demand and supply, let's step inside the firm itself. Every business, no matter its size, has to answer two fundamental questions. How much should we produce and what will it cost us to produce it? So lesson 3 covers the economics of production, that is the internal engine that determines whether a business is efficient or wasteful. In this lesson, we will build a strong understanding of how business combines resources to produce goods and service efficiently. We will begin by looking at the production, function, and the difference between the short run and the long run. Next, we will explore the law of variable proportions and see how adding more of one input while others stay fixed affects output over time. We'll also discuss economies and diseconomies of a scale and understand how a business average cost changes as it grows. Finally, we will look at core cost concepts and break-even analysis so you can understand how to determine the output level a business needs to cover its costs. So let's get started. So what is a production function? A production function describes the relationship between the inputs a firm uses, labor, capital, raw materials, land, and the output it generates. So mathematically, economist often writes like this. Q equal to F of L comma K, where Q is the output, L is the labor, and K is capital. But don't worry about the formula. What matters is the underlying idea. That is, the output is a direct function of how much and how well you combine your inputs. So this relationship isn't fixed forever. A firm can change how it combines inputs using more machines and less labor, or vice versa. And each combination produces a different amount of output. Understanding this relationship helps a business figure out the most efficient way to produce a given quantity. So economists distinguish between two production time frames, and this distinction shapes almost every production decision a business makes. In the short run, at least one input is fixed, usually capital like factory size or machinery, because these can't be changed quickly. A factory can't double its floor space overnight. In the short run, if a business wants to increase output, its main lever is a variable input, typically labor. It can hire more workers or add more shifts. So in the long run, all inputs become variable. A business can build a new factory, install new machinery, and completely restructure its capital base. The long run isn't a fixed period of calendar time. It's defined by flexibility. For a small business, the long run might be 6 months. For a heavy manufacturing company, it might be several years. So this distinction matters because short-run decisions and long-run decisions require completely different thinking. A short-run decision like adding a weekend shift to meet demand spike is about optimizing within fixed constraints. A long-run decision like building a second factory is about redesigning those constraints entirely. So now let's look at law of variable proportions. This is also known as the law of diminishing returns, and it's one of the most important and most misunderstood ideas in production economics. Here's the core idea. If you keep adding more of variable input like labor while holding other inputs fixed like machinery or floor space, output initially increases at an increasing rate. Then it increases at a decreasing rate. Eventually, it may plateau or even decline. Let's understand why. Imagine a small bakery with one oven. Hiring the first worker massively boosts the output. That worker can bake, package, and manage the counter simultaneously, barely. Hiring a second worker allows specialization. One bakes, one manages the counter. Output rises sharply. This is the phase of increasing returns. But keep hiring. By the fifth or the sixth worker, the oven, the fixed input, becomes the bottleneck. There's only so much that a dough that one oven can bake in a day, no matter how many people are standing around it. So each additional worker adds less and less extra output. This is the phase of diminishing returns. Eventually, you might reach a point where adding a 10th worker to a kitchen built for 4 actually reduces the output because workers get in each other's way, communication breakdown, and coordination cost outweigh the value each additional worker adds. So this is exactly why just hire more people to fix the bottleneck doesn't always work in real business. Without expanding a fixed input, more events, more space, more equipment, additional labor eventually adds less value and can even become counterproductive. So as a firm grows its entire scale of operation, not just adding labor to fixed capital, but expanding everything proportionally, average cost per unit typically falls at least up to a point. This is called economies of scale, and it happens for several reasons. First is bulk purchasing. Larger firms can negotiate better rates on raw materials because they are buying in much larger volumes. Specialization. As a firm grows, workers and departments can specialize more narrowly, which increase efficiency. An accounts team focused purely on accounts is more efficient than one person doing accounts, sales, operations simultaneously. Better use of technology. Large-scale production often justifies investment in expensive, highly efficient machinery that wouldn't make financial cost for a smaller operation. Spreading fixed cost. Costs like R&D, administrative, and marketing get spread across much larger number of units, reducing the fixed cost burden per unit. But growth isn't unlimited in its benefits. Beyond a certain size, firms can experience diseconomies of scale. Average cost per unit actually starts rising again as the firm grows further. This usually happens due to coordination problems. As an organization grows, communication between the departments becomes slower and more complex. So decisions that used to take a day might now take weeks, binding through layers of approval. The second is management complexity. Large organizations often develop excessive bureaucracy, which slows decision making and increases administrative overhead. Third is reduced employee motivation. In very large organizations, individual contributions can feel less visible, which sometimes reduces the motivation and productivity. Every firm has an optimal scale, the size at which it's capturing the benefits of economies of scale without yet suffering the drawbacks of diseconomies of scale. Identifying that optimal point is one of the central challenges of long-run business strategy. Now let's check the cost vocabulary that every business decision, pricing, production, planning, budgeting relies on. Fixed costs are costs that don't change with the level of output. Rent, insurance, and salaried staff costs are common examples. A business pays these whether it produces 1 unit or 10,000 units. Variable cost changes directly with the level of output. Raw materials, packaging, and hourly wages tied to production volume are classic examples. The more you produce, the more these costs rise. Total cost is simply fixed cost plus variable cost at a given level of output. Marginal cost is the cost of producing 1 additional unit of output. This is one of the most strategically important numbers in business economics because it tells you exactly how much it costs to say yes to 1 more unit of production, critical information when deciding whether to accept a bulk order or expand the output. Average cost is total cost divided by the quantity produced, essentially the cost per unit. As a firm increases output from very low levels, average cost typically falls first because fixed costs are being spread across more units. But at some point, as the firm nears the limits of its current capacity, average cost starts rising again, often because of the diminishing returns we discussed earlier. This produces the classic U-shaped average cost curve. So understanding where you sit on this curve tells you whether you're operating efficiently or whether you're either underutilizing your capacity or straining it past its efficient point. So break-even analysis identifies the output level at which total revenue exactly equals total cost. The point where a business neither makes a profit nor loss. Below the break-even point, the business is losing money on every unit sold, even if it's generating the revenue. Above it, each additional unit sold contributes to profit. This is calculated using the relationship between the fixed cost, variable cost per unit, and price per unit. Businesses use break-even analysis before launching new products, entering new markets, or making major capacity investments. It answers the fundamental question: how much do we need to sell before this decision starts paying off? So now let's have a recap of this lesson. We understood that a production function relates inputs to output. The short run has at least one fixed input, the long run does not, and the law of diminishing returns explains why adding more of one input eventually yields smaller and smaller gains in output. Also, economies of scale reduce average cost as a firm grows. Diseconomies of scale reverse this between an optimal size, and fixed cost, variable cost, marginal cost, and average cost are the essential building blocks of cost analysis. Break-even analysis identified the output level needed to cover the cost and is essential before major production or launch decisions. In this lesson, we will build a strong understanding of the different competitive environments a business can operate in. We will begin by looking at perfect competition and understand why firms in this structure have no control over price. Next, we will explore the monopoly and see how a single seller with high barriers to entry gains real pricing power. We will also discuss monopolistic competition and oligopoly and understand how differentiation and interdependence shape pricing decisions in each. Finally, we will look at how pricing power compares across all 4 structures so you can understand how market structure shapes competitive strategy. So now let's get started. So why market structure matters? Before we go through each structure, it's worth understanding why this classification actually matters so much. Market structure determines how much control a firm has over price, how easy it is for new competitors to enter, and how firms are likely to behave, whether they compete aggressively on price or compete instead on branding and differentiation. Get the market structure wrong in your analysis and your entire pricing and competitive strategy can be built on a flawed foundation. Let's start with the theoretical ideal, perfect competition. This structure has a few defining features. There are many buyers and many sellers, none large enough individually to influence the market price. Products are homogeneous, meaning essentially identical with no meaningful differentiation between one seller's product and another. There is free entry and exit. No significant barriers stopping new firms from entering the market or existing firms from leaving. And there's the perfect information. Buyers and sellers all have full knowledge of prices and product quality. Because of these conditions, individual firms in a perfectly competitive market are price takers. They have zero ability to influence market price. If a farmer selling wheat tries to charge above the existing market price, buyers simply go to any of the hundreds of other farmers selling identical wheat at the market price. If the farmer charges below market price, they are needlessly giving up revenue since they could sell their entire output at the market price anyway. So in a perfect competition, price is determined purely by the intersection of overall market supply and market demand, not by any individual firm's decision. Agricultural commodity markets are the closest real-world approximation, though even these have some deviations from the pure theoretical model. Since perfect competition is genuinely an idealized benchmark rather than something you will find in a fully pure form. I repeat, at the complete opposite end of the spectrum sits monopoly, a market structure with a single seller, no close substitutes for the product, and significant barriers to entry that prevent competitors from entering. These barriers can take several forms: extremely high startup cost, exclusive access to critical resource, government granted license or patents, or network effects that make it very difficult for a new entrant to compete once an incumbent has sailed. Because there is no competition, a monopolist is a price maker rather than a price taker. They have real direct control over the price they charge. But this control isn't unlimited. A monopolist still faces the market demand curve. If they charge too high, a price quantity demanded will still fall, potentially reducing their total revenue and profit. So even monopolists must find the price that maximizes profit, not simply charge the highest price imaginable. So utility providers like electricity, water are classic monopoly examples in many markets, often because it would have been inefficient to have multiple competing companies each building separate infrastructure. Indian Railways historically held a near monopoly position in long-distance rail transport for similar structural reasons. Monopolistic competition is where most of the consumer brands you interact with every day actually live. Monopolistic competition features many sellers similar to perfect competition, but with a critical difference. Each seller offers a differentiated product and not the identical one. Think about the restaurants, clothing brands, shampoo, or smartphone accessories. There are many sellers in each of these categories, but each brand differentiates itself through quality, branding, features, customer service, or perceived positioning. A customer choosing between two competing shampoo brands isn't just comparing price. They're weighing brand reputation, ingredients, packaging, and perceived quality. Because of this differentiation, firms in monopolistic competition have some genuine pricing power. Unlike perfect competition, they are not forced to match a single market price exactly. A well-branded product can charge premium over a generic competitor. But that pricing power is limited because close substitute exists. Push the price too far above competitors without a corresponding increase in perceived value, and customers will easily switch. This is also the market structure where marketing, branding, and product differentiation strategies matters the most, since competing purely on price isn't the only or even the primary lever available. So an oligopoly is a market dominated by a small number of large firms. Think airlines, telecom providers, automobile manufacturers, or cement companies in most markets. So what defines oligopoly isn't just a small number of firms. It's the intense interdependence between them. In an oligopoly, each firm's pricing and strategic decisions directly and significantly affects its competitors, and every firm knows this. If one telecom company cuts prices, the competitors almost always feel forced to respond quickly. Losing market share in concentrated market can be extremely costly. This creates a kind of strategic chess game where firms are constantly anticipating and reacting to each other's moves, a dynamic economic study formally through game theory. So this interdependence often leads to price rigidity. Firms may be reluctant to change prices frequently because a price cut invites a competitive response that could hurt everyone's margins, while a price increase risks losing customers to competitors who don't follow suit. This is why you will often see oligopolistic industries compete heavily on non-price factors instead: loyalty programs, service quality, product bundling, rather than constant price wars. So now let's compare the price and output decisions across structures. Let's bring these four structures together because the practical business implication is the most important takeaway here. In a perfect competition, a firm has no pricing decision to make at all. It simply accepts the market price and decides only how much to produce at that price. In monopoly, a firm has maximizing pricing freedom constrained only by the overall market demand curve. It sets price to maximize its own profit without needing to react to any competitor. In monopolistic competition, a firm has moderate pricing freedom driven largely by how well it can differentiate its product. The more distinctive and valued the product, the more pricing power the firm holds. So in oligopoly, pricing decisions are made with intense awareness of competitor reactions. A firm rarely sets price in isolation because in a concentrated market, competitors will respond quickly to any significant price move. Understanding which structure your business operates in, and often business operate in different structure across different product lines or regions, is one of the first steps in building a coherent pricing and competitive strategy. So in this lesson, we understood about perfect competition where many sellers, identical products, firms are price takers with zero pricing power. We understood that monopoly, that a single seller, high barriers to entry, firm is a price maker with significant but not unlimited pricing power. Monopolistic competition has many sellers, differentiated products, moderate pricing power tied to brand and differentiation. Oligopoly has few large firms, high interdependence, pricing decisions shaped by anticipated competitor reactions, and market structure fundamentally shapes what pricing and competitive strategies are realistically available to a business. In this lesson, we will build a strong understanding of how businesses translate economic principles into real pricing decisions. We will begin by looking at cost plus pricing and value-based pricing and understand the difference between pricing from your own cost structure versus pricing from customer value. Next, we will explore penetration pricing and price skimming and see how businesses choose between these strategies when launching new products. We'll also discuss price discrimination and understand how businesses capture more value by charging different segments differently. Finally, we will look at demand forecasting and break-even analysis so you can understand how businesses validate pricing decision before committing to it. So now let's get started. So everything you have learned so far, that is demand and supply, production and cost, market structure, comes together in one of the single most important decisions a business makes. That is pricing. Get pricing right and you capture the value you're creating. Get it wrong and even a great product can fail commercially. So lesson 5 covers how businesses actually approach pricing in practice. So the first and most straightforward pricing approach is cost plus pricing. You calculate the cost per unit of producing your good or service, then add a markup percentage on top to arrive at your selling price. For example, if it cost 400 rupees to produce a unit and you want a 25% markup, you would price it at 500 rupees. This approach is simple, easy to calculate and virtually guarantees that you cover your cost on every sale, assuming your cost estimates are accurate. But cost plus pricing has a significant weakness. It completely ignores what customers are actually willing to pay. It's an inward-looking method, focused entirely on your own cost structure rather than an outward-looking one that considers customer perception of value. A business using cost plus pricing might drastically underprice a product that customers would happily pay much more for, simply because that higher willingness to pay isn't reflected anywhere in the cost plus formula. So value-based pricing flips the starting point entirely. Instead of starting from your cost, you start from the value the customer perceives they're receiving and price accordingly. This approach is especially powerful in B2B and SaaS business where the value delivered can often be quantified fairly and directly. If a piece of software saves a company 10 lakhs rupees a year in operational cost, that company would very likely be willing to pay a meaningful fraction of that 10 lakhs for the software, potentially far more than the software's actual production cost. So value-based pricing captures that gap between the cost and perceived value rather than leaving it on the table. So the challenge with value-based pricing is that it requires much deeper understanding of your customer. That is, you need reliable data or research on what value they're actually receiving, which is harder to establish than simply calculating your own cost. So when launching a new product, businesses often have to choose between two nearly opposite pricing strategies, and penetration pricing is one of them. Penetration pricing means entering the market with a deliberately low price, specifically to build market share quickly and then gradually raising prices once a strong customer base is established. This strategy works particularly well when there are network effects or high customer switching costs. So once customers are onboarded and comfortable, they are less likely to leave even after the price rise. So you will see this strategy frequently in subscription, business, and telecom markets, offering aggressively low introductory prices to pull customers away from competitors, betting that customer retention and future price increases will make up for lower initial margins. So price skimming is the opposite strategy. Enter in the market with a high price to capture early adopters who are willing to pay a premium, often because they value being first or because the product currently has little to no direct competition, and then gradually lowering the price over time to capture increasingly price-sensitive segments of the market. Consumers electronics follow this pattern extremely consistently. A new flagship smartphone typically launches at a premium price, capturing customers willing to pay top price for the newest technology. So over subsequent months, as competitors catch up and initial demand from early adopters is satisfied, the price gradually falls to attract the broader, more price-sensitive market. So the choice between penetration pricing and skimming often depends on how quickly competitors can copy your product, how price-sensitive your target market is, and how much of your value proposition depends on being seen as premium versus being seen as accessible. Price discrimination refers to charging different prices to different customer segments for essentially the same product or service based on differences in their willingness to pay or not based on differences in the cost of serving them. So airline pricing is a textbook example. This exact same seat on the exact same flight can be sold at wildly different prices depending on what the ticket was booked, when the ticket was booked, whether it's weekday or weekend flight, and even who is buying it. Business travelers booking last minute are typically far less price sensitive than leisure travelers booking months in advance, and airlines price accordingly. So for price discrimination to work effectively, a business generally needs three conditions: the ability to identify different customer segments with different price sensitives, the ability to prevent easy resale between segments, so a low price customer can't simply resell to a higher price customer, and some degree of pricing power, meaning this strategy is more common in monopolistic competition and oligopoly than in perfect competition. Common forms include student and senior citizen discounts, off-peak versus peak pricing, and bulk purchase discounts. Each is a form of price discrimination based on identifiable differences in willingness to pay. So before setting a price or planning production volumes, businesses need some reasonable estimation of future demand. This isn't guesswork, it's a structured process, and it generally falls into two broad categories. Qualitative forecasting relies on expert judgment, market surveys, and consumer research. This approach is especially valuable for genuinely new products where there is no historical sales data to analyze. You're relying instead on informed estimation and direct market research. Quantitative forecasting relies on historical data and statistical methods, trend analysis, regression models, and time series techniques that project future demand on past patterns. This approach works best for established products with a reliable sales history, where past patterns are a reasonably good guide to the near future. So more sophisticated business combine both approaches using quantitative models as a baseline, then adjusting that baseline based on qualitative judgment about upcoming market shifts, competitor actions, or changing consumer sentiment that historical data alone wouldn't capture. So we understood break-even analysis in lesson 3, but it plays an equally central role here. In pricing strategy specifically, before finalizing a price, a business needs to know, at this price, how many units do we need to sell to cover our cost? This calculation directly connects pricing decisions to production and cost decisions. A lower price might drive more volume, but it also raises the break-even quantity since each unit contributes less profit towards covering fixed costs. A higher price lowers the break-even quantity but only works if demand at that higher price is sufficient to hit it. This is why pricing decisions can never be made purely by looking at cost, or purely by looking at customer value, or purely by looking at competitors. A sound pricing strategy weighs all of these considerations together, checked against the practical reality of what break-even analysis tells you about the volumes involved. So since we've come to the end of this lesson, we'll have a quick recap. Cost-plus pricing is simple and ensures cost coverage but ignores what customers are actually willing to pay. We also saw how value-based pricing prices against perceived customer value, capturing more of the value a product creates, and penetration pricing builds market share fast through low initial pricing. Skimming captures early premium demand. Price discrimination captures more total value by charging different segments differently based on willingness to pay. And demand forecasting, qualitative, quantitative, or both, and break-even analysis should precede every major pricing decision. In this lesson, we will build a strong understanding of the broader economic environment that shapes every business decision. We will begin by looking at national income measures like GDP and GNP and understand what they tell us about overall economic health. Next, we will explore inflation and unemployment and see how each directly affects a business cost and its customer spending power. We will also discuss business cycles along with fiscal and monetary policy and understand how government and central bank decisions influence business investment and consumer demand. Finally, we will look at the impact of globalization so you can understand how even domestic businesses are shaped by international economic forces. We have spent the last lessons inside the firm, inside individual markets. In this lesson, we zoom all the way out to the macroeconomic environment, the broader forces that no single business controls, but that every business absolutely has to navigate and plan around. So let's get started. Let's start with the most widely referenced economics indicator, that is GDP, or gross domestic product. GDP measures the total monetary value of all the goods and services produced within a country's borders during a given period of time, usually a quarter or a year. So GNP, which is gross national product, is a related but distinct measure. It takes GDP and adjusts it by adding income earned by countries' residents from investments or work abroad and subtracting income earned domestically by foreign residents or foreign-owned companies. Essentially, GDP measures production within a country's borders, while GNP measures income earned by countries' residents and businesses, regardless of where in the world that income was generated. So why does this matter to a business? GDP growth is one of the clearest signals of overall economic health. When GDP is growing steadily, it generally reflects rising business activity, rising incomes, and rising consumer spending power, a favorable environment for expansion, hiring, and investment. When GDP growth slows or turns negative, it usually signals weaker consumer demand and a more cautious business environment, which affects everything from sales forecasts to hiring plans. So inflation refers to the sustained rise in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over time. It's typically measured using indices like the Consumer Price Index, which tracks the price of a representative basket of goods and services that are typical household purchases. A moderate level of inflation, most economies target somewhere around 4 to 6% actually, is generally considered a sign of a healthy growing economy. But high or unpredictable inflation creates real problems for businesses. It erodes consumer purchasing power, meaning customers can afford to buy less even if their nominal income hasn't changed. It increases input costs, raw materials, wages, transportation, often forcing businesses to raise their own price just to maintain margins, which can further dampen demand. And it creates planning uncertainty since businesses struggle to forecast costs and rises reliably when inflation is volatile. So unemployment measures the proportion of the labor force that is willing and able to work but currently without a job. It's a critical indicator of overall economic health and, importantly, of consumer demand strength. High unemployment generally signals weaker overall consumer demand since a larger share of the population has reduced or no income, which directly translates into lower spending across the economy. This has a very direct effect on businesses, particularly consumer-facing businesses, since weaker aggregate demand means lower sales regardless of how good a company's product or pricing strategy is. So conversely, very low unemployment can create a different kind of challenge for businesses. A tighter labor market where it becomes harder and more expensive to hire and retain skilled employees since there are fewer available workers competing for open positions, giving job seekers more leverage in wage negotiations. Economies don't grow in straight line. They move through recurring phases known as a business cycle. So there are typically 4 phases here. Expansion, where output, employment, and income are rising. Peak, where growth reaches its high point before beginning to slow. Recession, where output and employment decline, typically define a decline in GDP over 2 consecutive quarters. And trough, the low point of the cycle right before the economy begins to recover and expand again. So understanding where the broader economy currently sits within this cycle has real strategic value for a business. During an expansion phase, businesses often lean into growth, increasing production, hiring, and investment since demand conditions are favorable. So during a recession, businesses often shift towards caution, conserving cash, delaying non-essential investment, and focusing on operational efficiency since demand is weaker and more uncertain. Businesses that can reasonably anticipate where the cycle is heading rather than simply reacting once conditions have already changed are generally able to time major decisions like expansion, hiring, and capital investment considerably more effectively than those caught off guard by a shift in the cycle. So what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy refers to decisions made by the government about spending and taxation. When a government increases spending on infrastructure projects, for example, it tends to stimulate broader economic activity since that spending flows through supply chains, creates jobs and increases incomes, which in turn increases consumer spending elsewhere in the economy. So taxation works in the opposite direction on businesses and consumers directly. Higher corporate taxes reduces a business after-tax profit, potentially discouraging investment, while higher personal income taxes reduces consumers' disposable income, potentially reducing overall consumer spending. So conversely, tax cuts tend to increase disposable income and business investment capacity. Monetary policy refers to actions taken by country's central bank in India, the Reserve Bank of India, primarily involving control over interest rates and the overall money supply in the economy. So when a central bank raises interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive for both businesses and consumers. This tends to slow business investment since financing new projects or expansion costs more, and it tends to slow consumer spending too, particularly on big ticket credit finance purchases like homes and vehicles. So when a central bank lowers interest rates, the opposite happens. Borrowing becomes cheaper, which tends to stimulate both business investment and consumer spending since financing costs are lower across the board. This is precisely why businesses pay very close attention to central bank announcements and interest rate decisions. A rate change can directly affect a company's cost of capital and indirectly affect consumer demand for their products, often within a matter of months. So finally, it's worth acknowledging that modern businesses rarely operate in complete isolation from the rest of the world, even if they only sell domestically. Exchange rate movements affect the cost of imported raw materials and components even for businesses that only sell within their own country. International trade policy, tariffs, trade agreements, export restrictions can reshape supply chains and cost structures with relatively little advance warning. And global supply chain dynamics, as many businesses learned very directly in recent years, can create ripple effects that reach even businesses with no direct international operations of their own. This means that even a business that sells exclusively within a single domestic market still needs some awareness of the global economic environment, since that environment increasingly shapes domestic cost, pricing, and competitive dynamics. So let's have a quick recap from lesson 1. So across all these 6 lessons, you've now built a genuinely complete toolkit for economically informed business decision making. You started by understanding how demand and supply set market prices. You moved inside the firm to understand production and cost structure. You explored how different market structures shape competitive strategy and pricing power. We examined how businesses translate all of this into real pricing decisions. And now we have zoomed out to understand the macroeconomic environment that shapes the backdrop against which every one of these decisions plays out. None of these 6 areas operate in isolation in the real world. A genuinely solved business decision typically draws on several of them simultaneously. A pricing decision, for example, requires understanding demand elasticity, your cost structure, your market structure, and the broader macroeconomic environment all at once. That's the real value of business economics. It doesn't give you a single formula, but a complete integrated way of thinking through complex business decisions with clarity and rigor. So in this course, we understood that GDP and GNP are core indicators of economic health that support planning and forecasting. Inflation and unemployment affect both cost structure and customer spending power. Business cycles, expansion, peak, recession, and trough influence strategic timing. Fiscal and monetary policy shapes investment costs, customer spending, taxes, and demand conditions. Globalization, that is, international forces increasingly affect domestic costs, pricing, and competition. Integrated economics, that is, real business decisions combine demand, cost, market structure, pricing, and macro context. And that brings us to the end of this course on business economics. Over these 6 lessons, we have built a complete framework for thinking about business decisions economically, starting with how demand and supply set prices in a market, moving inside the firm to understand production and cost structures, exploring how different market structures shape competitive strategy, translating all of that into real-world pricing decisions, and finally zooming out to understand the macroeconomic environment that every business operates within. So the real value of this course isn't in memorizing any single concept in isolation. It's in recognizing that these ideas work together. A sound business decisions rarely relies on just one lens. Pricing a product well means understanding elasticity, your cost structure, and your competitive environment, and the broader economic conditions all at the same time. That integrated way of thinking is what separates reactive decision making from genuinely informed strategy. Whatever field you work in, Whether you're in marketing, operations, finance, or general management, the ability to reason through business problems economically is a skill that you will serve throughout the career. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next course.